There is a document sitting inside a federal archive right now that was never meant for your eyes. Not because it contains launch codes or names of foreign assets, but because of something far more unsettling. It contains a detailed, clinical, almost surgical breakdown of exactly what happens to a modern American city when the system stops working. And more importantly, what the government plans to do about it. Spoiler, their plan doesn't include you. The document is real. Multiple documents, actually. Some were pried loose through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers, journalists, and privacy watchdogs who spent years getting stonewalled before finally receiving heavily redacted PDFs that read like someone took a black marker to every useful sentence. Others were partially declassified after the Cold War, when certain planners decided that the Soviet threat was dead enough that it no longer mattered if citizens knew what continuity of government actually looked like from the inside. And what it looks like is this. A parallel country, hidden inside your country, designed to function perfectly while the one you live in burns. Let's start with the foundation, because this entire subject rests on one concept that most people have never heard of: continuity of government, or COG. This is the official framework, developed, refined, and funded since at least the Eisenhower administration, that governs how the federal government survives a catastrophic disruption. Nuclear war, pandemic, large-scale domestic insurrection, grid failure. The assumption baked into COG planning is that these events are not unlikely. The assumption is that they are inevitable. The planners don't use the word if, they use when. And when you read their documents through that lens, the entire tone shifts. These aren't paranoid bureaucrats theorizing in a vacuum. These are engineers designing a fallback system for a machine they fully expect to break. The most famous piece of this infrastructure is also the most misunderstood. Most people, if they've heard of it at all, know it as Mount Weather. Located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, Mount Weather, officially called the High Point Special Facility, is a full underground city. Offices, dormitories, a hospital, a power plant, its own water supply, and enough storage to sustain hundreds of government personnel for months. It has been operational since 1959. FEMA runs it now, and their official line is that it serves as an emergency operations center, which is technically true the way saying a submarine provides transportation is technically true. Accurate and deeply incomplete. What Mount Weather represents and what similar facilities like Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania and the Greenbrier Resort Bunker in West Virginia represent is a government that made a deliberate decision decades ago. Read this slowly. The bunkers are not for you. The food stockpiles are not for your neighborhood. The pre-positioned communications equipment and the emergency broadcast infrastructure and the classified relocation procedures are all oriented toward one goal: keeping a functional chain of command alive. What happens to the 30 million people living in the urban corridors they've quietly assessed as high-risk zones is a logistics problem that falls well below that priority. Now here's where the documents get interesting and where you, as someone who actually lives in one of those cities, should start paying very close attention. Buried inside declassified planning frameworks, including portions of FEMA's National Response Framework, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Civil Crisis Management Plans, and COG-adjacent documents obtained through decades of FOIA litigation, is a consistent operational picture of what urban areas look like in the first 72 hours after a major infrastructure failure. The planners don't call it chaos, they call it degraded civil order. It's a beautiful bureaucratic phrase that means the same thing as chaos, but sounds manageable on a spreadsheet. And what the documents agree on, across decades of different administrations and different threat scenarios, is the sequence. The sequence of how a modern city comes apart is almost mechanical in its predictability. Hour 1 through 6, nobody knows anything yet. The power goes out, or the water pressure drops, or the cell network becomes unreachable, and the initial response from most of the population is a kind of stunned normalcy. People assume it's temporary. They sit in their cars with the radio on, they check their phones obsessively, they post on whatever social media platform still has cached connectivity. The government's internal models, and this is documented in the FEMA crisis behavior literature, show that the majority of urban residents in this phase are actively resistant to believing anything serious is happening. This is not stupidity. It's a psychological defense mechanism called normalcy bias, and that is so reliable and so consistent across populations that emergency planners have built it into their timeline models as a fixed variable. They know you won't act in the first 6 hours. They've scheduled around your inaction. Hours 6 through 24. The resource calculation begins. Not at a government level, at the individual household level, simultaneously across millions of people who have suddenly realized that whatever is happening is not resolving on its own. And what the COG documents understand with brutal clarity, the thing they've modeled extensively, is that this moment, the moment of individual resource calculation, is the moment when the social contract starts to develop fracture lines. Because once a person realizes they are vulnerable, the next thought is always about the neighbor who might not be. This is where the urban emergency protocol documents become survival intelligence, and where the government's internal planning diverges sharply from anything they've ever told the public. The standard public messaging around disasters is all about community cohesion, shelter in place, help your neighbors, listen for official broadcasts. The internal documents tell a different story. The internal operational picture assumes conflict. It assumes that by 36 hours in a dense urban environment with no power and no water, you will have visible signs of civil disorder. Not everywhere, not in every neighborhood, but enough in enough places that law enforcement resources become stretched beyond any realistic capacity to respond. The math simply doesn't work, so the protocol is triage. Protect critical infrastructure first. Power substations, water treatment facilities, communications nodes, then major transportation corridors, then, if resources permit, residential areas. In that order, every time. What this means practically, and this is where the documents stop being historical curiosity and start being operational intelligence, is that in the early phase of a serious urban emergency, you are on your own. Not because the government is malicious, because the government has already decided in advance and in writing that the infrastructure is worth the neighborhood. And that decision is rational at a systems level. Water is always first, not food. Water. Every urban crisis scenario in every planning document prioritizes the water treatment and distribution system as the most critical and most vulnerable infrastructure node. The reason is simple physics. Water is heavy, it's difficult to store in meaningful quantities, and urban populations have been systematically conditioned over generations to depend entirely on municipal systems. When municipal water pressure drops, which happens within hours of a serious grid failure because the pumping stations run on electricity, a city of 1 million people suddenly has access only to whatever's in their pipes, their tanks, and their bodies. Imagine hour 48. Every faucet in a city of 1 million people runs dry at the same time. There's no announcement. The pressure just slowly dies. The last toilet flush, the last glass. That's it. That moment, the government has modeled it, named it, and planned around it, is when a manageable emergency becomes something else entirely. The internal planning literature flags the 48-hour water loss threshold as the single most reliable trigger for accelerating civil disorder in an urban environment. Not fear, not misinformation, thirst, which means your first, most critical, most non-negotiable preparation is water storage and water procurement, before a bug-out bag, before anything else. 1 gallon per person per day is the absolute survival floor. 3 gallons if you want to maintain basic sanitation, which matters more than most people realize because sanitation failure is how a water crisis becomes a disease crisis. We saw this play out in real time in Jackson, Mississippi in 2022, when a winter storm caused the water treatment system to fail across an entire city. Jackson had nearly 150,000 residents. The city went without reliable running water for weeks. Stores ran out of bottled water within hours. People lined up in sub-freezing temperatures for National Guard distribution points. And Jackson had warning. It had some lead time, some external support, and it still collapsed into distribution chaos within 2 days. Now remove the warning. Remove the external support. That's the scenario the COG documents are actually built around. The next thing the planning frameworks flag consistently across different eras and different threat scenarios is the communications environment. And not in the way you'd expect. The concern isn't that communications go dark entirely, though that's a real risk. The concern is that they become unreliable, fragmented, and actively managed. FEMA's crisis communications framework includes provisions for what they clinically call information environment management during a declared national emergency, coordinating official broadcasts, suppressing panic-inducing misinformation, and in extreme scenarios, prioritizing government bandwidth over civilian network access, which means in a real crisis, the information flowing through official channels will be curated. This is why the survival logic embedded in these documents consistently points back to something that sounds almost embarrassingly low-tech: local relationships built before the crisis. Not a prepper cache, not a generator, people. The neighbor who's lived on your street for 30 years and knows every pattern of this neighborhood better than any satellite map. The community radio operator. The former EMT on the third floor. Emergency planners have known since at least the 1980s, and it's documented explicitly in the community resilience literature that feeds into COG-adjacent planning, that neighborhoods with pre-existing social trust consistently outperform individual preparedness in urban crisis scenarios. You cannot outstore a city, but a street can become a unit. It concerns something called cascading failure sequencing. When planners model the shutdown of urban infrastructure, they don't model each system in isolation. They model the interactions between failing systems, because in a real crisis, it's never just one thing that breaks, it's the chain reaction. Power fails, which kills the water pumps, which degrades sanitation, which creates disease vectors, which overwhelms hospitals already operating beyond their backup generator window. Most hospital generators are rated for 72 to 96 hours of fuel, which removes medical response capacity at precisely the moment it's most needed. Then fuel supply chains stall because the distribution network requires powered infrastructure to function, then food logistics seize up for the same reason. Each failure doesn't add to the previous one, it multiplies it. Emergency planners call the point where this chain of multiplying failures exceeds the existing response infrastructure the cascade threshold. The internal models, synthesized from power outage annexes, public health emergency frameworks, and urban logistics studies, consistently point to a window of several days, not weeks, before the scale of simultaneous systems failures begins to require military-grade external intervention to stabilize. Think about what that means. Not the cavalry that shows up in 72 hours with water trucks and MREs, the kind that requires federal coordination, National Guard deployment, logistics chains that take days to spin up, and a chain of command that, as we've already established, has other priorities in the early phase. By the time that support arrives at the neighborhood level, you've already been through the hardest stretch without it. We got a compressed preview of cascading failure in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017. The power grid failed. Without power, water pumps failed. Without water, hospitals began operating in crisis conditions within days. Fuel for generators ran out. Communication infrastructure degraded. And the federal response, which was not intentionally slow, which involved real effort and real resources, still took weeks to meaningfully penetrate the worst affected areas. Puerto Rico was an island, which made logistics harder, but the sequence was the same sequence the COG documents model for urban mainland scenarios. Same cascade, same timeline compression, same gap between when people needed help and when help arrived at scale. This brings us to the piece of the planning picture that is the most carefully interpreted by researchers who've spent years reading these frameworks, and also the most misrepresented in online discussions of this topic. Inside various COG-adjacent planning frameworks, including documents referenced in connection with the Rex 84 readiness exercises that surfaced partially during the Iran-Contra hearings in the 1980s, there are consistent references to pre-designated geographic priority sectors within major urban areas. Researchers and FOIA analysts who spent years reconstructing the operational logic from available documents interpret this as a triage framework. Certain urban zones are designated high priority based on strategic asset value. Critical infrastructure, government facilities, major transportation nodes, while high-density residential areas without strategic assets are effectively deprioritized in the early response phase. The exact language varies by document, and much of the most specific material remains redacted, but the operational logic is consistent and coherent across everything that has been released. Read that again. The language used in these frameworks, self-management capability applied to civilian populations in deprioritized zones, is bureaucratic in a way that only makes sense once you accept the underlying assumption, which is, in a genuine large-scale urban crisis, there is not enough response capacity to protect everything simultaneously. Something gets deprioritized. The document suggests something is the residential neighborhood, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. And here is the final layer that makes this entire body of planning documents genuinely useful rather than just disturbing. The government made all of these triage decisions in advance, calmly, rationally, with good data. They did the math on what breaks first and in what order. They identified the exact variables that determine whether a population makes it through the cascade window or doesn't. They named those variables: water, communication, social cohesion, medical access, fuel continuity. And then they built their own survival infrastructure around them while telling the public to keep 3 days of supplies in a bug-out and wait for official instructions. 3 days for a crisis whose cascade models run well beyond that. That gap between what the government planned for itself and what it told you to plan for is not accidental. It is the entire point. And now, you know it exists, which means the next move is yours, not theirs. The underground document on urban survival isn't a single file. It's the accumulated output of 70 years of people whose job was to plan for the worst-case scenario honestly, without the softening filter of public communication. They couldn't lie to themselves, their models had to actually work.
And what they built, when you read it carefully and follow the logic all the way through, is an accidentally comprehensive guide to exactly what you need to do to survive in a place they've already written a contingency plan for deprioritizing. Read it that way, and it stops being a document about government secrets. It becomes the most useful survival manual ever produced, written by people who knew exactly what was coming, just not for you.